Well, it's good to be with you tonight. Before I start a world affairs briefing on the Trump administration and what it has to do with the world, I want to just make a few comments about the Utah situation. Out of nowhere, suddenly you had another party come. You know, you've had the Constitution Party and the Libertarian Party for years here in Utah, and they have a substantial following, but they never get on the debates, right? But suddenly, Utah United Party comes out of nowhere, and who gets on the debate? Jim Bennett. And that's because the system is rigged. You know, it's very easy for them to give a little promotion and have Jim Bennett thrown out there and have his father endorse him and then get some polling done, skewed as it is, to show that you've got enough to make the threshold to get on the debates. If they did the same thing to the Constitution Party, the Libertarian Party, they'd get on the debates too. But the system's rigged because this state is run by what they call moderates or centrists. And they've robbed us of all the good words. You know, a liberal used to be a libertarian. And they commandeered that word, and now we have to call leftists liberals. And of course, they call the most leftist of the Republicans moderates. So we've lost the battle of words because they are the ones in charge of the media. But it's a sad thing that you don't really have a good choice for the congressional race coming up. It's a sad thing that Jason Chaffetz bowed out of the race. He's never told why. And I have a feeling I know why, but I'm not going to say publicly. But it's not good. You don't leave a position of power like he was in without having a problem, and he has a problem. But in any case, John Curtis is not a conservative, been a Democrat before. And of course, Jim Bennett is not a conservative, and he's part of the liberal Republican regime, which rules the media and most of the GOP. And it shows you why it's important to keep a caucus system, which we've lost now in Utah. Because you see, a caucus system puts the most knowledgeable people, the most activist people in charge. They come out to the caucus meetings and they vote, and they're much more well-educated and know the issues enough to vote a proper vote. And the establishment here in Utah, the liberal establishment, wanted to make sure that you killed the caucus system. And they couldn't kill it outright, and so they gave us through the courts. And you'll see the courts are the way that it's the ultimate veto over the power of conservatism is to use the liberal courts. But they, of course, ruled that, you know, the legislature had the right to say that you must have a primary. And of course, that's ridiculous. The Republican Party is a private organization. It's not a governmental organization. The state of Utah has no control. You cannot legislate about a private organization and how they run their party. But they did. And the courts upheld that. And they lost the battle. And so you had two systems. And how did John Curtis get in? Not through the caucus system, through the petition and primary system of signatures. And so he's in, and he won over Mr. Herod, who would have been a much better choice. And so I'm afraid what's happened, though, is we've now are the permanent minority, because I'll tell you, they outvote us, they outnumber us. The moderate liberals, and that's because the leadership of the state, as well as the predominant church, you know, is not conservative, is not constitutional conservative, to say. They view themselves as generally conservative in the moderate realm, meaning the liberal realm. But they're not truly wedded to the Constitution. And so those of us that are in the minority now. And we can't really win another election anymore without the caucus system. The only reason that President Donald Trump won was because he was a populist. Had he been a constitutional conservative, he never would have got the blue-collar votes necessary to win. Now, we were cautiously optimistic, and I said so in my World Affairs brief a year ago when he was elected. It was a major shock and a surprise. And we were cautiously optimistic because of all the things that he promised. If only he did half of those things, we would really put the deep state in our world of hurt. And as I said in the World Affairs Brief, I said, at least I don't trust Donald Trump to really follow through with a lot of things, but at least he's going to stop the deep state and put them on hold for a while. And he's done that on a few things. Especially the TPP, or the Trans-Pacific Partnership. He's put that globalist trade agreement on hold and it's gone nowhere. He's also been able to stop any legislation of the liberal variety from passing so far. And that means that the liberal agenda, the leftist agenda, has been stymied now for an entire year, except in foreign policy. In foreign policy, Trump has failed us miserably. And it's not that Donald Trump is an establishment person. He's not a deep stater. He's not a co-conspirator. A lot of people on the alternative still accuse him of that he's just playing us for fools. But I'll tell you, Donald Trump cannot read a script, let alone follow a conspiratorial agenda. He just cannot do it. It's not in his nature. And so he's not controlled directly. But they know how to manipulate and to influence Donald Trump because he has some really strong weaknesses. One of which is, and it's a rather interesting thing, he's got good instincts initially. He sensed immediately, we got to take care of North Korea. And then he got talked out of it. And then being talked out of it, he got embarrassed because he was talked out of it and North Korea is still a problem. And so he gets on the high horse again and his instincts take over and he comes in. And so on health care, for example, his instincts were Obamacare is a terrible thing. It's not the Affordable Care Act, it's the Unaffordable Care Act. And so his natural instincts, we got to get rid of it. And of course, the problem is you've got a narrow majority in the House and the Senate, especially in the Senate. And that narrow majority is, it only takes 2 or 3 liberals, leftist liberals, to stop the Trump agenda. They've done it every time, and they're going to do it again on tax reform. And so what did Trump do? It was about a month and a half ago. He got tired of being attacked, and they were reading him very carefully. This is a man who's got a big ego. He's been a star. He's been a media magnate for many, many years. He's not used to being unpopular. He's not used to being attacked. And finally, he got fed up with it. After the 3rd time that his health care reform failed, and so he decided, I'm going to make a deal with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, invites them to the White House. They had a great talk, and he agreed to not shut down the government, to give them what they wanted, not to build the wall or to put it off, that is the debt ceiling increase, until December 23rd. Now, does anybody in their right mind think that Donald Trump's going to shut down the government on December 23rd, right before Christmas? I mean, that was the most stupid political move he ever made, as if he was going to negotiate something that further on. But he calls up Nancy Pelosi after this White House conference and said, Nancy, did you see all the wonderful press we got? This was just great. He was reveling in the fact that suddenly he was popular. And why was he popular? Because he betrayed his principles. He betrayed his campaign promises, and the media was loving it, and he was enjoying it. That shows you the weakness of Donald Trump, that he would enjoy getting the pressure off of him. And then he got counter pressure back from his supporters saying, hey, you don't build that wall and you give up and talk nice to Nancy Pelosi and we're through with you, Donald. And he repented again. And when it came up to the actual bill in the budget thing, the wall was back in there and he'd backtracked on what he said to Nancy and Chuck Schumer. I'm only pointing this out to you to show that this man is not stable. We can't depend on it. Why does he get talked out of his proper instincts on North Korea? The only solution for North Korea is a military solution. You have to take this guy out. Why can't negotiations work? Because he said that the missile program and the nuclear program are not on the table. That's non-negotiable. So what is there to negotiate about? And yet they keep telling him, you can't do this, the international community will crucify you if you don't talk to them. And so they've had secret talks with North Korea. They've gone nowhere. Finally got tired of them and said to Rex Tillerson, forget about negotiation. They're not going to work. And so he's got 3 aircraft carriers on the way to Korean waters. The Theodore Roosevelt is in Guam, which is very close. The USS Ronald Reagan and its task force is in the East China Sea, in the waters over North Korea, and the Nimitz is steaming towards that area. It was off the coast, off the Gulf, doing ISIS attacks, and it's going through the Straits of Malacca right now. It'll be on station in about a week and a week and a half. And then you have 3 aircraft carrier groups. And that includes destroyers, cruisers, submarines, tenders, minesweepers. There's a whole bevy of ships associated with a carrier task force. You can't keep 3 carrier task forces steaming around the waters of Korea forever without doing something. So I think Trump's going to do something. They're trying to talk him out of it, and they're working overtime at that. And the reason they're trying to talk him out of it is that North Korea, as I've said to you many times before in this meeting, if you've heard me before, has always been designed as the trigger event for World War III. It's the perfect trigger event. It's a puppet state of Red China and Russia. And what greater thing to have a crazy man start the war? It's not our fault. The crazy man did it. And everybody thinks he's not crazy. He's spoiled, he's rotten, he's a temperamental person, but he's fairly unstable, had his sister killed and had other people, an uncle killed. I mean, he's just lust for power, and they let him get away with it. But I want to tell you, though, that China controls the North Korean military. They don't do anything unless China says so. Now, why don't sanctions work through China? Because China already is making a lot of their products made in China in North Korea. And they have a lot of North Koreans manning factories and things in China. So they're in bed with North Korea to make sure that they can bypass sanctions. They produce, they get most of the coal for their coal-fired electrical plants from, they get it from China, they get the coal from China and they get their oil from Russia. And neither of those are going to abide by those particular sanctions. So sanctions aren't going to work. It's not going to be negotiable. This man really has to be taken out. We should have done it the first time. The reason the Korean War didn't work is because it was run under the United Nations. And under the United Nations, the head of the United Nations military missions is always a Soviet general. And so everything that MacArthur's plans had to be approved by the United Nations, went through the Soviet general, and they told Red China and North Korea, so they always knew when we were coming. And so just as MacArthur was beginning to win again and pushed up through what's now the 38th parallel, the United Nations says, ceasefire. Let's call a halt. And that's what I'm afraid would happen again if they don't do this right in North Korea, is that they'll call a ceasefire again and you'll save Kim for another day. You see, North Korea is the perfect trigger event for World War III because if they attack South Korea, the U.S. has troops there and they have to respond. And North Korea has about 2 million men, 1 million active, another million in reserves, ready to push across the demilitarized zone. How many troops do we have? We've got about 46,000 service personnel. Only 13,000 of those are actually combat troops. South Korea has about 50,000. Only about 25,000 to 30,000 are combat troops. And so, round numbers, you've got 2 million against 50,000. That's not very good odds, is it? Especially when you're only 60 miles away. You don't have much time to react. And so the U.S. would have to use some major deterrent to stop those forces. Now, they can get North Korea has a very, very weak air force. They've got about 40, top of the line in their world fighters. And they're actually third generation in terms of our types of fighters. And they've got several hundred old World War II airplanes and pre-World War II jets. MiG-19s even, MiG-17s, and MiG-31s. MiG-31 used to be a pretty good aircraft in the Vietnam era, but not anymore. We've got F-35s in there, and as all the bad press that you've heard about the F-35, you've got to remember the F-35 could do something that no other aircraft can do in a fighter role. It has such a powerful computer thing, it can act as an actual AWACS It can know where every other fighter is, and it can direct and share database information with other fighters, and this is a new game changer. The F-22 can maneuver and turn and burn with the best of them, but the F-35 can coordinate and shoot multiple targets. Now, the F-22 can shoot multiple targets from one platform, but it can't see over the horizon. It takes an AWACS to see over the horizon to tell it where the targets are. But the F-35 does all that. And you get 2 or 3 F-35s spread out around, and it's a formidable force. And that's why, despite its terrible cost overruns and its problems with the oxygen system, I can't believe the U.S. military keeps putting in an oxygen regeneration system. In the fighters I used to fly, we had an oxygen bottle, and it worked perfectly. Never had a problem. What do they do now? They manufacture oxygen by concentrating it out of the atmosphere, and it gets toxins in it, and it gets poisons, and it makes them sick, and it doesn't operate, and they get hypoxia, and they start to pass out. I mean, it's a major problem. Every one of these new fighters has all this wonderful technology, and they're making pilots dumb and drowsy and fatigued because of the dumb oxygen system. And it's been a major cover-up. In fact, it was a cover-up until a lot of the pilots went on strike and said, we're not flying until you change the system. So what did they do? Instead of going back to the oxygen bottle, they kept the flawed system and they added an oxygen bottle. I mean, they just won't quit when you got a bad system. They just added an oxygen. And the reason they wanted to get rid of it is too much weight. Now you got both the bad system and the oxygen bottle, but that's neither here nor there. I'm just saying that's one of the reasons why our military is so bad. Did you hear about, of course, all the collisions on the Navy ships out there? And the Navy come out and relieved certain people of command, and then they came out with reports saying what their remediation is going to be for the Navy. And what is it? You got to get more sleep. Sleep on a Navy combat ship? I mean, they're implying that they were asleep at the wheel. I mean, you got a nighttime crew on there in the Combat Information Center. They've got all kinds of bells and whistles and screens, GPS, and telling you every ship in the area for miles around. They weren't all asleep. I mean, they may have been looking at girly magazines, they may have been playing cards, they may have been some asleep and other things, but this was just a lack of discipline, a terrible lack of discipline. And the Navy's covering it up. And that's the problem that we have today, is that we have so much cover-up going on. The greatest cover-up, and I'm going to divert now to what happened in Las Vegas, because I have never ever seen, I thought JFK was big in terms of the cover-up. Then I thought 9/11 was big, because 9/11 was a pure government black operation from beginning to end, and it had to have a major cover-up. But I have never seen anything like Las Vegas. And what it does, combined with what's happening to Donald Trump, it shows us how powerful the deep state is. Let me just give you a brief summary of what happened in Las Vegas. You have a guy named Stephen Paddock who was up there, supposedly made in 2015. His income tax showed some, was it $5 million he made from gambling, winnings and things. And of course, you don't give complimentary rooms at the casinos to people who are winning that much money from you. You give complimentary rooms to people who are losing a lot of money. That's what you give complimentary rooms for. So now they changed the story and said he was losing for the past 2 years, so as to justify why they got complimentary rooms. But you notice there were 2 rooms involved in the shooting. There was a room next door to the suite. I can tell you that casinos may give you a suite, but they don't give you a room adjacent to it. And the media has never talked about that other room. What's it doing there? Why does one man break out 2 windows when one at the suite has the best view of the shooting view? Why does he break out another window? And as I covered in the World Affairs Brief, there's 3 anomalies, lots of videos about multiple shooters. But the most dramatic things are all of the other casinos that were shot up during the thing. The Tropicana, outside of New York, Bellagio, Hooters, and nothing in the press. Now, I found out recently from Ron Holland that the Las Vegas Review-Journal told about other shootings in the Bellagio and the Tropicana on the day that it happened, and then nothing. Now there's videos, and I published them in the World Affairs Brief, the links to the videos showing the ambulances, 17 ambulances showing up at the Tropicana and hauling people out, ambulances showing up at the Hooters, bringing them out. I mean, how do you not cover this in a city like Las Vegas? And then, as I pointed out this week, they found out through the IntelliHub organization, IntelliHub got a hold of the FAA tapes from the airport. The airport's right across from the Festival 91 venue, right across from the main highways. And here in the airport tapes, the controller of the tower is saying to the airplane coming in, runway, the 19s are closed now. Those runways 19, which is right along the road, are closed. There are active shooters on the runway. They are on the airport property. They, notice they. Now this isn't Stephen Paddock, who's dead up there in the Mandalay Bay. They, that means multiple shooters crossing the runway. And this is an official government tape recording. And then someone else got a picture leaked from the police. You saw the one about the feet of Stephen Paddock lying on the ground and some shells scattered around. Now remember, if you'd shot for 9 minutes with automatic weapons, you'd have a pile of spent brass ankle deep around you. And there must have been 15 or 16 shells scattered around on the floor. But this picture of him dead lying on that, and I'm going to get a little graphic here because there is a stain of blood that is approximately 18 inches around the head, that's long since soaked into the carpet, and then there's a new fresh pool of blood coagulating right around the head. And there's 4 spent shell casings on top of that blood. Now you think about that. He supposedly committed suicide. How does spent shell casings from a rifle get on top of your blood after you've bled out and died, and shell casings get on top of the blood? How does that happen? You just sit there dying and keep pulling the trigger? No, this guy was killed. One of the policemen admitted now that he discharged his weapon when he went into the room after supposedly he was dead. Accidental discharge, or was it? Or was he still alive and they had to finish him off with another bullet to the head? You see, one of the things about the multiple shooters, and we have a video, and I published it in the World Affairs Brief, of a guard in a yellow vest pulling out a submachine gun and pointing it. You see the flash when it goes off as he kills a few people. There's a woman in the hospital that said she has 3 wounds to the chest. Now with a bump stock weapon, a bump stock is a semi-automatic weapon that has a special movable arm guard that when it kicks back, it jerks the hand and it just keeps firing. But you can't control it. It just jerk, 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 jerk all over the place. I saw a professional on a video trying to hold and hit a target at 25 yards, couldn't hit a thing with a bump stock. Because it was just... So you can't get 3 bullets in the chest of a person 1,000 feet away. You cannot do it. That had to come from bullets closer on. I showed a video of a fence that's bordering the airport, across from the road from the airport, and this has a fabric on a chain link chain. You see a bullet hit it. The fabric goes like this and back in from left to right. There's the Bellagio over there. That's proof that a bullet came from the airport side. And combined with the FAA tapes, it proves that there were shooters from the airport. But you see, if you had a submachine gun used for one of the guards, and that was reported to the police, it said live shooter at gate number 7, that was on the police audio, and sure enough, that video was of that guard at gate 7. There would be 9mm bullets in some of those corpses, or some of those wounded. That means the doctors have got to know some of those bullets are not 223 rounds, but 9mm. Now, that's the neat thing about killing the lone shooter. This is like Oswald all over again, just a single lone shooter. Because once you kill him, there's no trial. There's no need for forensic evidence. You don't have to prove. You don't have to bring in the doctors. You don't have to match the bullets to the weapons. You see how convenient that is, that he had to be dead and that there has to be only one shooter? Now, it's very interesting that there are some civil suits being filed and in the process right now against Mandalay Bay, and charging them with negligence, etc., and they're going to try to prove. But I'll bet you the courts as they usually are controlled, will stop any of that forensic weapons or any of that forensic evidence from coming forward. I mean, how do you curtail a conspiracy like this? How do you curtail all the doctors and nurses? And a lot of people thought this was, crisis actors, that nobody was really shot. Not true at all. The hospitals were overloaded with people because there were no victims coming out and talking about it. Well, that's because they were in the hospital. They weren't able to come out and make a video for a week or so, but then it started to come out. They talked about being shot and how they survived, etc. Interestingly enough, at least 3 of those witnesses who saw multiple shooters are now dead from car accidents. A special kind of car accident. Single car accidents that go off the road and crash and burn, some of them. Now, how many times have you seen a car have a crash and explode into flames? Now, you see it on the movies all the time, right? You go over the time and crash and boom, big fireball, but not in real life. The way the cars are designed now, they cannot explode. The last one that used to explode was that, what was it? Pinto. Yes, it was the Pinto that had the gas tank right there by the rear bumper, and when it would get rear-ended, it would explode, or it could explode. But not anymore. It just doesn't happen. So somebody tampered with the steering and put an incendiary type of device in there so that it would explode. It happened to Ron Holland, who was this guy who's a really active alternative media guy who's been on Jeff Friends with myself talking about this. His car ended up being sabotaged, driving around the freeway, and all of a sudden his car started to shimmy, his steering didn't feel right. He quickly pulled over. Had he not, he would have lost it, because when he pulled over, he found out that his lower control arm had come completely out. Now, a lower control arm, let me just picture this for you. Here's the tire on the side turning around. It's got an axle. And on front-wheel drive cars, it's got a flexible axle that comes in that spins it. So it's got to have something to keep this wheel upright. So it's got a lower control arm, which is a big metal rod that comes up with a pin that comes up with a great big nut. And some of them are crimp-type nuts that require 80 pounds to undo, 80 pounds of torque to undo. And others have a cotter pin in them. So you have to remove the cotter pin, and even then it takes a lot of pressure to undo them. This thing was completely off, the nut was gone. That was sabotage. There's no way that could have happened without somebody removing that nut. And so this is the degree. What I'm trying to say to you is that we are seeing, because of Donald Trump we are seeing the deep state come out in mass, and we're seeing more manifestations of their control. I mean, you know that they control the major media, Washington Post, New York Times. They've lost all semblance of neutrality. They used to play like we're neutral, right? I get a Google News feed every single day, and because Google is owned by the same people who own Washington Post and New York Times, guess what most of the feeds are on Google News? Didn't used to be this way. It only started this year. Washington Post and New York Times, both of which charge after 5 or 6 times you click on those links, they start to charge you. But nevertheless, every single one of these articles is anti-Trump, blatantly anti-Trump. Trump doing this, Trump doing this, Trump is just crazy. When's the last time, I mean, you older people here, remember, you never saw newspapers take a direct opinion in the major of just attacking another politician. It was just a violation of journalistic ethics. They're gone now. Just everything is gone. And it just shows you to that degree that they are controlled. But I thought, you know, how blatant can you get when the Las Vegas media, Las Vegas, it's like 10 Mormon churches in Salt Lake City got blown up, and they had a lone shooter type of thing at one, and the Salt Lake Tribune only covered the one and wouldn't cover the fact that there were 10 other churches that were blown up in Salt Lake City, as if it never existed. I mean, it's amazing, isn't it? How much control that shows, and especially since they covered it the first day, that means somebody telephoned them all and said, no more, do not cover this. Now, Ron Holland has a theory on that. He feels that the casinos are overbuilt there in Las Vegas, and they're on the verge of bankruptcy, a lot of them, which is possible. I mean, Mandalay Bay is in real tough straits now. It's virtually empty still. Very few people at Mandalay Bay. And so they've got to be hurting financially on this stuff. So they cover this up, but here's the bigger question. This obviously had to be a government black operation. Couldn't it have been ISIS? Well, that's the same thing as a government black operation because the government created ISIS. All they did was take about 50% of the Syrian rebels that they were funding and said, you're now ISIS. Just a name change. I mean, that's the only way that that organization can come from nowhere to a force of 50,000 people in less than a year. You don't do that through Islamic word of mouth. You do that because somebody, and it isn't that US CIA agents go up and through a translator tell them you're now ISIS. Their leaders, I believe, are mostly Israeli Mossad-trained Arabs. The Israelis are the best in the world at taking Arabs that live in Israel, who are loyal to Israel, and training them as infiltrators into, they infiltrated Iran, Iraq, and to this day in Jordan, all of those countries have Israeli Arab infiltrators monitoring what's going on, and they're the best that there is because they're actual Arabs. They speak, it's not like an American being trained to speak Arabic and then trying to infiltrate them. You're not going to get away with it, but you take a real Arab and you put him in there. And I think they've trained them as terrorist leaders, and they're the ones running ISIS. And that explains why the US sends helicopters into Mosul and gets out the ISIS leaders so they can live another day. That's why they made that deal in Raqqa. Remember, that was the headquarters of ISIS. And the US said, let's make a deal to avoid civilian casualties. Now, mind you, this was after they'd bombed the city into smithereens, so there were no civilians anymore there. But to save civilian casualties, we're going to make a deal so that we'll give you free passage, ISIS, out of Raqqa if you'll lay down your weapons. And that's what they did. The US transported all the ISIS out so that they could fight again another day in ISIS. They did the same in Mosul. They surrounded the city except one sector out to the west. It was like a big pie shape where no Iraqi soldiers and no US soldiers were allowed to go so that ISIS could escape. More proof that ISIS is a US-controlled terrorist. Now, it isn't that the ISIS terrorists know that, although they must wonder, driving around all these white Toyota pickups that came from the United States. But the point is they're dealing with other Arabs who are the leaders. The Arab leaders, who I believe are Israeli Mossad trained, they know who's running the show. Saudi Arabia knows because Saudi Arabia is the biggest whore in the Middle East. It takes money and gets protection from the US. You know, the Saudi Arabian hierarchy is a bunch of pedophiles and immoral people in a so-called, the haven of Mecca, the great bastion of Islamic fundamentalism. And the royal family is just a bunch of corrupt sexual perverts. And the US promises them protection if you toe the line. We'll make sure you are not overthrown. And they have. Same with Bahrain, that little island right off the coast of Qatar, which used to be a part of the US war on terror, supplying ISIS and other things until they got, they had some kind of backlash between there and Saudi Arabia, and they decided to go with Iran rather than with the United States. And of course, the United States keeps making Iran to be the boogeyman of the world. What do they say about Iran? This is the greatest sponsor of terror in the world, isn't it? Who's the greatest sponsor of terror in the world? Well, Saudi Arabia is second, but it's really the United States and British intelligence because they're the ones providing most of the power and the money and the say-so and the direction of this. And it started with the 9/11, where they decided to start the war on terror in order to have an excuse to intervene in your fundamental rights and to take your shoes off in the airport and buy all these expensive X-ray scanners from Michael Chertoff and Associates, who was head of Homeland Security and made himself wealthy. Shame on Mitt Romney for hiring Michael Chertoff to run his political staffing. I mean, that shows how naive Mitt Romney was, trying to please the establishment, bending over backwards. And they still didn't want him for president. Because like Donald Trump, you can't have somebody in the White House who isn't part of the deep state, or is at least a puppet. He's going to see too much. Someone like Mitt Romney is smart enough that he would see. Donald Trump is content to look the other way. They keep Donald Trump running from one little fight to another. He doesn't have any time really to get educated as he used to. Reading the internet, he would get enough to know that there was a 9/11 conspiracy, there was a JFK conspiracy and other things. And what did he announce just the other day about releasing all the JFK files? That we can finally put these conspiracy theories to rest. Let me tell you, those files have been purged. I've been going through them. And there's nothing in there that it's all been purged about government connections with. The only thing that I found that came close was an admission by the CIA that they were working with the mafia relative to an assassination attempt on Fidel Castro. But the files of the JFK, they had 25 years to purge those, make sure there's nothing in them, because they knew 25 years from when Congress said that they were going to get released. They knew we better get rid of all that stuff. And so it's been cleaned out. The only thing that's left is a lot of disinformation. For example, all the Oswald stuff. Oswald would work for the CIA, but he was sending him around, setting him up as a patsy, setting him up to appear like he was a Marxist, married a Russian. His girlfriend, after he left Maria, the Russian, said he was patriotic, he loved Kennedy, he hated Marxism, he hated the Russians. He was just doing that as part of his CIA assignment. And yet, what's about half of the files in the JFK about Oswald's connections with the Soviets and with the Marxists? It's just all junk. And that's why we're not going to find anything else out about that. The deadline passed for releasing the files on Martin Luther King. There's 15 file cabinets from the FBI that are in the archives, National Archives, all sealed. Now, when I was in Washington in 1983, I talked to Assistant Director Gray after Hoover died, and I asked him, I said, what's in the files? And he said, well, about 13 of those files, no, he said, about 3 of those file cabinets are full of Martin Luther King's collusions with the communists and our trailing him and doing that. And he says the other 12 or 13 files are just full of pornography. All of our video and audio tapes of him cavorting with prostitutes almost every night, including in Sweden when he was receiving his Nobel Prize. This man was addicted to sex. And this is supposedly irreverent, that we have a national holiday. He was a plagiarist. Got his doctorate through plagiarizing other people. This man should never be a hero. And yet it's so politically incorrect if you decried Martin Luther King to be crucified as a what? As a racist. If I called Donald Trump on abusing women, would I be called a racist? No, but if I called Martin Luther King for abusing women, I'd be a racist. They really know how to play the words against us. One of the other things that we've learned through the operations of the deep state through Donald Trump is the role of the courts. Every good thing that Donald Trump has done with executive orders, and I don't include the Muslim ban, that was really stupid. He should have been much more careful rather than name particular countries. But the courts have intervened. Look at that, he did the right thing in saying the military has no business dealing with transgenders. And what did the courts come out and she said, the lady judge from Washington, D.C., born-again leftist, said the military has never been able to prove, because they used the RAND Corporation. The RAND Corporation is a globalist organization. The RAND Corporation came out with a study and said that transgenders and gays and men don't cost the military but a few $1 million a year. Baloney. You know what transgenders demand? And if you look at these pictures, when this all came out of these transgenders, here you have 4 men sitting in uniforms. They're all dumpy, they're all ugly, dressed as women. Now those people go into the military, and you know how the military can really be cruel. You dress up like a woman, and you look as ugly as they do, and you're going to get ribbed to death. And of course you have all this sensitivity training now. You've got to be sensitive to their transgender needs. But what does the military got to do? On submarines they've got to put in special bathrooms. You can't let these men go into the women's bathroom like they want to. So the military has to send, you can't refit a ship with new bathrooms without a lot of expense. So what they have to take away from the men and take away the women and put new labels on the door. This is costly. But it's extremely costly to morale. the tension, the antagonism within units to have a man claiming to be a woman within a union and then within your unit. I mean, it's just very, very bad for morale. So the courts are more and more showing their role as parts of the deep state. And we see how broad the reach of the deep state is when they can get to the Las Vegas Review and Journal and get them to shut down talking about shootings in the tropics as if it never existed. I mean, can you imagine these journalists? You're asking me to do what, even after we published it, to never mention this again and to deny it? And to say yes to it means these journalists are whores. They don't have any principles. They've all said yes. I haven't heard one of them resign. Have you? In Las Vegas? Heard of any journalists resigning over this? That proves they have no principles. And that's the same way around. And so we have to be very, very careful. A lot of times I get asked through emails, you know, what are some news sources that I can trust? And I say to them, frankly, you can't trust anything in the mainstream, although I listen to mainstream news because it tells me what they're pushing and what they're covering for and what direction they're going in. If you understand what secret combinations are about and understand the deep state, you can learn a lot from what they don't say in the middle. But you've got to know what's out there first to know what they're not saying. You've got to know what they're leaving out before you can see how hypocritical they are. So that means you've got to rely on alternate news sources. Now there's several that do have a lot of good stuff in it, like Alex Jones' Infowar.com. My problem with Infowars is often the conclusions are hyped up or erroneous, but the raw data is usually good. They get good sources. They're some of the first to get it out. And so if you go to Infowars and you read the raw stories, but be very careful because the conclusions they derive from that are often hyped and wrong. One of the worst sources is Dave Hodges of Common Sense Show. He's the biggest hypester on the net. And he never apologizes for him being wrong, even though he's wrong every single week. I've never heard him apologize and say, well, I was mistaken about this and this. Never. So you never trust a source that's hype. You never trust Hal Turner of Superstation 95. Hal Turner used to be an FBI informant masquerading in the conservative movement, purposely planting false conspiracy news, and he got then set up by the FBI, sent to prison. He sued the FBI, and it came out in his trial that he was working as an informant for the FBI, pretending to be a conservative. Now he's back out of prison, started a news station, and he's back at it again. So don't repeat or pass on anything that comes from Hal Turner of Superstation 95. There's a lot of other dicey websites out of there, and what I want to say though is that you've got to be careful of sites that have some truth in it, that appeal to your sense of the last days and tough times and being pro-Trump or whatever it is, because there's just an awful lot of disinformation people out there. Down at one of the Air Force bases in Florida, they have a whole team in the U.S. Army that does nothing but imitate conservatives on Free Republic and other websites, and they get on geoengineering.com and try to debunk the chemtrails and other types of things, and so a lot of these people get outed, you know, by savvy people that are on that. But it's just amazing how much disinformation there is out there. So what I'm trying to say is that you've got to develop your own sense of what's right and what's wrong, and that requires the use of conscience. You know, your conscience, if you really listen to it correctly, in most of the temporal affairs, will start to warn you about disinformation. You'll be reading something, you'll get a feeling, it doesn't seem quite right to me. And it doesn't tell you what is right, but at least it gives you a warning signal that something's not quite right there. And I think Donald Trump gets some of those signals. The trouble is, he doesn't have any background, any experience in the military or in conservative principles. He hasn't got a conservative background in order to counter the very sophisticated excuses he gets. A couple of months ago, he went into the Pentagon tank, which is this top secret soundproof room where they give top level briefings. And they pulled him in there. What did they do? They gave him a briefing that was essentially a repeat of what all these military briefers get at the War College. The National War College is taught by Georgetown professors, all globalists. And they school them on the wonders of U.S. projection of military power and why it's important to keep businesses and, to keep stability around the world. And they preach this globalism, all couched in terms of nationalism, national interest. But it's all globalist garbage. They gave Trump that same briefing. And Trump asked a lot of questions. That's when Tillerson made that remark, he's a moron, for the questions that he asked. But you see, the trouble is, Trump never really argued. He would ask a question, but these briefers had a pat answer to give to him. And the globalists always have these pat answers. They've got these excuses that seem rational unless you're savvy enough, know enough background that you could say, wait a minute, that's not right because of this, this, and this. Trump didn't have those answers. So he would ask a question, they'd give him a pat answer, okay, he'd move on to something else. So you see, Trump does not have, he's got good instincts, but he doesn't have the wherewithal to combat the very sophisticated answers his globalist advisors are giving now without Steve Bannon there. And Steve Bannon really wasn't good on the deep state. He just knew that globalism was bad. And he was very, very intent upon making sure that Trump stayed true to his campaign promises. And so was his sidekick Cohen, who they've both been kicked out. Now Trump has no one in the White House to advise him and to give him any warning signals that what he's may be doing is wrong. The only thing that's working in Trump's favor is the fact that the advice he's getting isn't working, like in North Korea. And that's why Trump has got 3 aircraft carriers over there. I tried it your way. I listened to Xi. He didn't do anything. Sanctions aren't working. Negotiations aren't working. They aren't going to work. I'm going to take some military action. Well, in the meantime, these 3 aircraft carriers, they're working on him day and night to make sure that he doesn't do anything. Now, they've got a bevy of potential military scenarios for him to pick one. And it's very easy for them to get him talked into a scenario which won't do the job. Let me tell you what it does do, what it takes to take down North Korea. North Korea has 3 legs of its military offensive power. The most lethal is not the missiles, because he could maybe launch a dozen missiles, but he's got 15 to 20 artillery tubes within range of Seoul that can unleash a barrage. Now the warheads aren't as big as a missile, but they can unleash a barrage within 10 minutes of the U.S. attacking North Korea. That's the real problem, is the artillery. It's a lot of artillery tubes. So you've got to take out his artillery tubes, you've got to take out his air bases so that you have air superiority, and you've got to take out the missile fields. Take about 500 to maybe 600 cruise missiles to do that, as well as a lot of air sorties. We've got, several squadrons of F-16s. We've got 3 aircraft carriers. Each one of those have 3 fighter squadrons, fighter attack squadrons on board. You've got a lot of firepower. You can do a lot of damage to those things, but you're going to take some hits in South Korea, even if you do it right. I think in one day, if I were advising Trump militarily, I would say in one day, you've got to use major area weapons, big bombs, even neutron weapons on the artillery line all along the DMZ, so that you basically kill the personnel on the first day. Now, you take out the air bases with cruise missiles so that the airplanes can't take off, and you take out all his missile sites. You can do that easily in one day. But then he's got long-range artillery that's buried into the mountains over 60 miles away from Seoul. They're in the first range of mountains, and they're on the back side, so that you can't hit them with counter-artillery, and they're on railroad tracks. They go into a tunnel, they come back out, they fire, and they go back in. Very difficult to hit. But you can take them out. What you do is you set up a CAP, which is a circular air patrol that's circling around these valleys where these come out. You can actually attack their tracks so that they can't get out of the tunnels. But you could also have a circular air patrol with Gatling guns and other things. As soon as they come out, you just riddle them. So you can take care of those things, but it requires a really dedicated, savvy military strategy to do that. Will they do that? I don't think so. If you do anything less than that, Seoul is going to get a major artillery barrage. In fact, General Mattis was in Korea a couple of weeks ago, and all the South Korean generals could do was tell him we've got this artillery problem. And we can't get to their long-range artillery, these LRAs, which are in these mountains and things. And all Mattis could say was, I understand, I understand. He didn't have an answer for them. There are military answers. Now, he's not an aviator. He doesn't know about perhaps those types of things. But still, it's a shame to have the top Secretary of Defense, a military general, who didn't have an answer to the artillery question. And there are answers to those things. But what I'm afraid of is that they're going to do a token strike with B-1 bombers and bomb some other significant things. Remember, the strategy that I outlined of attacking only artillery, military air bases, and missile bases, you don't kill any civilians. So they can't come to you and say, look, all the damage that you have, this is just strictly a military strike zone. And it keeps Kim from basically, it doesn't get rid of Kim Jong-un, but you know, you can put up a barrier around there. You can tell China, we're going to bomb anything coming across the border. None of this North Korea or South Korean war situation where the Yalu River was safe zone for you. We're cutting off North Korea and until they yield. And then you could do that without killing. I'm sure there'd be a lot of hell to pay for the civilians that are starting to starve, and you could even throw in some food aid or something, but nothing militarily gets into that country, and you can starve them out. But I don't think that's what's going to do. I think what they'll do is do a half-baked military thing so Trump can say, I had a show of force, and then we're going to have a Korean War because Kim is going to retaliate against South Korea, and South Korea then is going to start another Korean War. And then, rather than win this war like they should have done in 1951, his advisors are going to tell Trump, ceasefire, ceasefire. They've been beaten enough, you know. Call a ceasefire. And what they do, let me just put this in the global perspective. Remember, North Korea has been preserved for years as the trigger event. How do I know it's been preserved? Because of how the globalists treat North Korea compared to Iran. Does Iran have a nuclear weapon? Not yet. Are they trying to? Yes. I would be too if I knew that the globalists were trying to kill me. But Iran is not the enemy of the United States, except they know the United States is in front of the globalists and trying to get them. It really is defensive on their part. But they have been trying to kill Iran for years. We used to have 2 aircraft carrier groups in the Persian Gulf at all times ready to strike Iran. As soon as Israel started the war, they were waiting on Israel to use an air attack to hit their nuclear reactors, knowing that Iran would attack American troops in Iraq, and that would bring the U.S. in and we'd take care of Iran. That's what it was. And they stopped that in 2007. Remember the national intelligence estimate that came out in 2007? What did the CIA say? We've decided that Iran doesn't have a nuclear program. I mean, after all the propaganda for the past 10 years about nuclear program in Iran, suddenly in 2007 they say, we don't think that Iran has a nuclear program. And everybody says, what? And with a straight face, they said that. Why did they do that? They did it because Ron Paul was running for president. And there was a real big anti-war fever, and it was accruing to the favor of Ron Paul. They knew that if they went through with their attack on Iran, another intervention, that Ron Paul would probably get the Republican nomination, and even the Democrats would vote for him because they're so anti-war in those days. And so what did they do? To kill Ron Paul's candidacy, they denied him the war thing by saying, and they pulled out their carrier groups in 2007. And then as soon as Ron Paul was defeated, what? 2008 National Intelligence? Yeah, Iran does have a nuclear program, and it's right back on again. And not a single mainstream newspaper, not the Washington Post or New York Times, ever questioned, ever challenged, said, this is crazy. That shows they're part of the scheme. They know when to criticize and when not to criticize. I found out because of what I called the accidental observer to a City of London meeting that took place a couple of years after that. This was a big financier in the City of London. The City of London is a small financial enclave in the middle of the City of London, okay? It's part of the old Anglo-Saxon globalist empire. It's what controls the banks and the stock markets, etc. These are the real financial controllers. Most of the financial control now has gone to New York and Washington, D.C. because of American prominence, but that's where it started, and they still run their globalist meetings. So this high financier got invited to a meeting, and he shows up at the meeting. They start talking about the globalist agenda. And there's an American general there, and there's a British general, and there's several other people didn't recognize. And he says, I'm not supposed to be here. You know, I'm not financial. But you see, he was so high in the city of London finances that everybody thought he was a globalist. So he got invited to the meeting. So he starts taking notes. And he didn't understand a lot about talking about Russia and China and what they were trying to do. But the thing he picked up on was how dissatisfied they were that Israel had not yet attacked Iran, despite being tasked by us since 2004 to attack Iran. Right out there in the open. And they said, wow. And the reason that Israel wasn't attacking Iran is because Syria was right next door with all those missiles and chemical weapons. And so Syria had said and given an ultimatum to the globalists, we're not going to attack Iran until you take care of Syria first. And that's why 3.5, almost 4 years ago, the U.S. started to attack Syria. It was right after that meeting when Israel said, we're not going to do this until you get rid of Syria. And how did they justify attacking Syria? They claimed that Syria set off chemical weapons in a suburb of Damascus. Now, you all know what chemical weapons are: mustard gas, sarin gas, and other things. Is it a precise precision weapon? No, chemical weapons are an area weapon. Once they go off, the wind takes it where it's going to do, and it kills people indiscriminately. Do you ever, from a military point of view, use mustard gas or sarin in a civilian environment? No, you only use it on troops out in the open, where you're going to just kill troops. That's what they were designed for. You can't control it in a civilian environment. Bashar al-Assad is a Western-trained ophthalmologist, speaks English, married to a British wife, very pro-Western. He's not stupid. He knew that the U.S. was looking for a violation of chemical weapons. Do you think he'd be stupid enough to set off a chemical weapon in civilians? It has no military value, is do nothing but we now know that it was the U.S.-backed rebels that set off the chemical weapons to blame Syria. And that debate is going on today. This very week, Russia vetoed a resolution in the Security Council which was going to condemn Syria for all of the list of chemical weapons, and Russia said they didn't do it. The U.S.-backed rebels did it, and we have the proof. And the Joint Intelligence Organization that had not even been to this latest one where they had claimed, they just took the word of the white helmets who worked for the Syrian rebels, the U.S.-backed rebels, took their word for it, that the Syrians dropped sarin gas, but they didn't drop sarin gas. The picture of the shell is an artillery shell that has been run over by a truck in a hole that they... That's not how chemical weapons are delivered. They blow this way. They don't crush inward. You know, this was a setup. I mean, it's just incredible what the media buys. These people are supposedly so smart, and yet they buy this kind of propaganda that comes out. And that's because they're told to buy it, of course. They're not dumb enough to not know that this is false. But in fact, the Syrians bombed a weapons depot of the rebels. They told the U.S. in advance that we're going to bomb that depot. The U.S. knew that they were keeping stockpiles of chemical weapons and other chemicals in that depot and that they would get blown up in the process. And they didn't tell the Syrians. They were going to blame them on it. So a lot of this stuff happens in the U.S. is just totally disingenuous. That's why I have to laugh about, you know, the Russian interference claims, which have no substance at all. It's like William Binney, the top NSA whistleblower, said just this week, he said, you know, whenever the NSA says, we know with high certainty that such and such is true, he says, you know they don't have any evidence whatsoever. Now this is an NSA top-level analyst. He says, when they say high certainty, they have no evidence, because if they had the evidence, they'd say, here's the evidence. They don't have to say high certainty. This is a cover story. And he said, look, They track everything in the internet. They have thousands of node connectors all over the world for internet. They know and can trace every piece of traffic. So why don't they deliver us the proof? If you have high certainty, you track all the internet around the world and every email. Forget about meta tags. They got the content too, because the meta tags are part of the content. You have to separate them out after the fact. You can't get the meta tags and not the content. So the NSA is lying about not spying on the American people. But Benny says, show us the evidence. But in fact, the DNC leaks that got to the DNC emails, John Podesta emails, got to through Seth Rich, a DNC staffer who was very upset with what Donna Brazile has now come out openly and said that the Clinton campaign took over the DNC and fudged the whole process so that Bernie Sanders couldn't win any primaries, and has basically admitted what Seth Rich knew. And he leaked this information to WikiLeaks because he was so mad about it, and then he got killed. And they covered that up. Stopped the doctors from attending to him, left him alone to die in the hospital. Police came in and surrounded his room and said nobody gets in, including the doctors, and let him die. And the doctors who operated on him said he was fine. We'd taken out the bullets and we had sewed him up, and they always survived like this. And we came back the next day, he was dead, and the police had not let anybody in the room. This is how the deep state works. Now, do you think those policemen are part of the deep state? No, they're just following orders. And so are most of the journalists. They don't want to know. They see what happens to people who betrayed Hillary and Bill Clinton, and 50 people died. They see what happens in Las Vegas when people who witness multiple shootings end up dead from a car accident, running off the road and hitting a tree. That telegraphs a message to people. Don't mess with us. You don't have to have or tell all of these hundreds of thousands of people in the establishment there's a conspiracy and you're part of it. That would scare them to death. You just give them little hints here. There's a powerful system and you don't want to cross it. And that's how they work the conspiracy. So it is very complex. And don't say that you can't run a conspiracy. I always give the example of Area 51. You know, they have plane loads of people and drives and buses that go out to Area 51. Thousands of people that work there every day. The most top secret place of secret military development in the world. Not one in the last 30 years has ever talked about what goes on in Area 51. Not one! So don't tell me you can't keep a secret if the threats are heavy enough. People say, how could 9/11 have been an inside job? How could all of these people who have loaded explosives into those buildings, somebody's got to talk. No, they don't. They get killed. And it's not just that they get killed. They tell them, we're going to kill you, your wife, your children, your children's children. They put the fear of the devil in them, and they don't talk. But it's a shame that we have so many unprincipled people that are living today that know that, what they did, and how many people that they were responsible for killing. But we were only following orders. That's one of the great damaging things that we teach our military. Yeah, there is, there are illegal orders, but we don't know of any. And you aren't ever to question if there's an illegal order. So I think I've given you a pretty big picture of where the deep state stands in opposition to Donald Trump and you and I, even here in the state of Utah. I'm not sure there is very much that we can do about it. When you see how they've come out and controlled Donald Trump and kept him from doing anything, even as unknowing as he is, I mean, if you had someone like myself in the White House, I'd be dead within 3 days probably. There's no way they would allow someone who really knows what's going on, how to ferret out the NSA to take over the presidency. So I'm not optimistic about winning against the secret combination that empowers this government. And that means, and this is what I fear most, is that we keep ourselves hyped up with hope that somehow we'll win, somehow there'll be a Donald Trump. Now remember what I'm telling you. No one principled could have won what Donald Trump. Donald Trump won because he was a populist and an unprincipled person who could make promises that he had no intention of keeping, or maybe hoped he could be, but really wasn't intent upon keeping. He hasn't fought for them. He's really wanting to get the heat off his back, so he's looking to compromise. His version of Obamacare, Trump care, is 99% of Obamacare. And the tax reform is really kind of a mixed bag. His negotiations with NAFTA aren't going anywhere, and they're going to end up being pretty much the same as what now exists. So I don't think we're going to get much. But they still hate Donald Trump, by the way, because it is slowing them down. It is stopping their agenda, except in foreign policy. And in foreign policy, what he's threatening to do is use up the trigger event for World War III before its time. He's ruining it. And what I mean before its time is because Russia and China are not ready. And that's why China's trying so hard right now to get Kim to come to the table to make some concession to stop Trump from attacking. Because they're not ready to follow up on their threat, which they made twice now, that if you preemptively attack North Korea, we're going to come in and defend and we'll start World War III against you. But they're bluffing. They aren't ready. They haven't even started building their top line, in mass production, their top of line new equipment. And neither is Russia. That stuff isn't planning on coming into full production in 2020, 21, 22, and 23, and 24. And I don't think they're stupid enough to want to take on the West until they've got this top-of-the-line type of equipment in place. And that's why everybody, including the globalist advisors, are trying to stop Trump from attacking. But he is probably going to do some kind of military strike. And we're probably going to see, at a minimum, a Korean War. And there's probably still a 40 to 50% chance that China could decide to take on the U.S. early. In fact, the globalists might not mind that, because it's easier to recover from a strike from Russia and China if they're not fully prepared to carry through with a full war plan. Believe me, the globalists intend to win this war, even though they're going to let the U.S. military be attacked and decimated through a preemptive strike from Russia and China. I've talked about this before. It's the secret of PDD 60. The long-lost Presidential Decision Directive 60 that nobody thinks about and that Donald Trump doesn't even know about. What does it say? It basically tells the U.S. missile forces not to rely on launch on warning, but to be prepared to absorb a nuclear first strike and then retaliate afterwards. Now you think about that. As General Butch Neal says, retaliate with what? After he heard about that. He was second in command of the Marine Corps at the time, since retired. A good friend of Richard Pooley here, who's in our audience here today, who's a former Marine artillery officer. But Butch Neal knew what he was talking about. Do you know what launch on warning is? That means when our satellites detect their missiles launching, we launch our missiles before their missiles hit ours. So their missiles hit what? Empty silos, because our missiles are already in the air. And what do our missiles hit? They hit real targets. So the one who launches second in a launch on warning system wins, not the one who launches first. And that's why it's very important. Now, do our missile forces think that they're not going to be allowed to launch on warning? No, they still practice for it. But PDD 60 also removed the alternate launch codes, so that if the codes don't get from the White House to the missile forces, they cannot launch, and neither can the submarines. So what happens if one of these little underlings, when Trump says, pull the trigger and send the codes, doesn't send the codes? Launch on warning doesn't happen. We absorb a nuclear first strike. Now, the Russian Chinese going to hit cities? Is that their military doctrine? It's their propaganda doctrine. The Chinese say we can always, nuke Chicago, or they threaten that thing. But that's not what they're planning on doing, and the U.S. knows that. They don't want to be the ogre of the world. They're taking out the bully of the world. They want to take out the U.S. military, and that's why the first strike will be on U.S. military targets. And I'm here to tell you that PDD 60 says that if you have children and grandchildren in the military, they're going to be sacrificed for this globalist agenda of getting us into World War III. Now, what's the advantage to the globalist of allowing the U.S. military to be taken out in the first strike? What's the advantage? We become powerless. They can come out of their bunkers. And why do they have bunkers deep under the ground? Because they know this is coming, okay? Why do retired CIA higher-ups and FBI build beautiful cabins in Aspen, Colorado, and other places in the mountains with big, deep underground safe rooms in them because they know something's coming. Are they warning you? No. I'm probably one of the few that's warning that it's coming because I'm probably one of the few that's ever written about PDD-60. And the only reason I know about it, because it's still top secret, is because Craig Cernillo of Arms Control Today helped write it. And one of the Washington Post or New York Times columnists came out and said, no, this doesn't stop us from doing launch on warning. This doesn't. And he wrote an op-ed piece that says, yes, it does stop launch on warning. And that's how he let it out. And he's got a summary in Arms Control Today of November 1997. It's still there on the internet. You can find it. Arms Control Today, their magazine, November 1997. You can read it for yourself. Now, it doesn't say it in quite as clear terms as I'm doing, but it does very clearly say that the military is not supposed to rely on launch on warning. What PDD-60 do is completely revamp our nuclear doctrine. The nuclear doctrine before that time under Ronald Reagan and others was to win a nuclear war. And they changed it to say it's not to win, it's just to survive and retaliate after absorbing a nuclear force. That's a major change. And Donald Trump, our own president today, doesn't even know this PDD exists because nobody's telling him. And I can't get to him, or other people can't get to him as well. So what does that mean to you? It means, and we hear a lot, by the way, about EMP. And there's a lot of hype on the internet about an EMP strike. Why have a nuclear strike when you just throw an EMP and knock down the grid? Well, it's not quite that simple. The latest government data is that it takes about 6 high-altitude nuclear weapons to take out the entire grid. 6. And the most powerful electromagnetic radiation is in a radius about 300 miles on the ground under each of these 6 weapons. Under those 300 miles, cars will get damaged and may not run afterwards. Outside of that 300-mile circle, generally more or less, cars will restart. Eddy currents in the computers will make it shut down and then it'll restart. That's what their testing shows. So forget about Iran or North Korea sending off one lone missile and doing an EMP and taking down the grid. It's not going to happen. Only Russia and China have that capability. And they're going to follow their EMP with a physical strike on military targets. So if you suddenly see an EMP, 1 second after scenario, watch out. If you're in San Diego, Seattle, or Colorado Springs, where there are military bases right next to the city, you're going to see some real fireworks within about 15 or 20 minutes. Now, if you see, and I used to say, if you see North Korea strike South Korea, probably within a week we'll have Russia and China do their preemptive strike on the U.S. coming into support. I'm not saying that is necessarily going to happen this time because Trump's doing it too early and Russia and China aren't ready. So it's still up in the air. But what I'm trying to tell you is it's going to happen someday. If anybody sitting in this audience thinks that we're going to keep going in the next 10 or 20 years and never have a war with North Korea or Russia and China, you're fooling yourselves. We have not had a war that's touched our American shores since the beginning, really. But it's going to happen. And if you keep waiting for some conservative savior to be elected, you're going to be disappointed. It's not going to happen. We are the permanent minority in this country, and we're never going to have the majority. The public schools are driving people into the hands of the left. Do you realize that in Brigham Young University, where they have taught socialism since I was in political science there, they've taught socialism for 30 or 40 years. Till now, and it's only because of the good instincts of some people that they don't turn into socialists, 30% of BYU students voted for Hillary Clinton in the last election. 30%. In my day, it might have been lucky to be 3%. So they're making ground. And that's why Utah United is getting such a quick foothold, is because there's so many people are being preached liberalism in the leftist turn and pro-government, and anti-conspiracy and anti-constitutionalism, and labeling you as radicals. And they're being affected by this, by the mild-mannered, all is well in Zion feeling, and that's what they're being enticed to. So I'm saying we're a permanent minority. Now, will God leave us hopeless? I don't think so. I think there'll always be pockets of liberty. I think there will always be pockets. That's one of the reasons why I wrote the book Strategic Relocation. Because the thing that keeps Christians and conservatives in the big cities is what? Jobs. But once an EMP strike comes and a war comes, those jobs are gone. And in fact, it's not just that the jobs are gone, there's total social unrest and pillaging. People start to, go house to house, stealing food and commandeering things after 3 days when the stores are empty. What's going to keep you in the big cities? Nothing except that you have no place to go if you haven't prepared a retreat. If you haven't prepared or at least some relationship with family or friends that live in a rural area. You have to think about this thing in advance. You can't just say, oh, wait a minute. Mr. Skousen reminded me of that 3 years ago when I heard him speak in Highland, and now it's here and I haven't done anything. It really is something, when you look back and you say, well, I'm tight financially and I've got this and this problem, you'll always have excuses. But let me tell you this, it will never get better. Going down, the economy's eventually going to get worse and worse, more and more inflation. You've seen the latest statistics. Wages haven't risen in 10 years. Has inflation risen? You bet it's risen. An average of 8% a year. Now the government says it's 2 to 3%, but they're lying. They fudge the figures. It's 7 to 8%. And that's why you get further and further behind unless you're in a business where you can raise the prices along with that. But I don't think it's ever going to get better. I don't think your situation is going to get a lot better, or you're going to get younger. You're not going to get younger. The time to start preparing is while things are available. And so I've written several books, and I wrote these years ago, and they've been updated recently. I wrote these years ago for myself because I knew that I was going to have to prepare this. And I eventually put them out for other people because there was a demand for this. So let me tell you what I have written. I've talked about strategic relocation. Now, most of you are in Utah, so you don't need this. But you may have family or friends that are living in LA or San Francisco or any other big city that really do need to make plans for strategic relocation. There's an awful lot of information about threat analysis in this too, about the war threat, about pollution, water, earthquakes, tornadoes, everything about threats and things. But it's been the most popular book that I've ever written. But for most of you, what you need are probably either one of these two books. And this is the Secure Home, and this is the High Security Shelter book. Now, the Secure Home is 700 pages. Just recently been updated with the help of my son, Andrew, who's in the back of the room. This has everything you need to know about preparing and securing your home. And the new update is completely updated about all the newest equipment, especially solar and generators and things. Solar has taken some real dramatic advances here recently in what we call self-consumption. And that is, normally under most solar systems you sell back to the grid, and when the grid's down, can you produce any power from your house? No. Not unless you have a battery bank. Okay, let's suppose you sell power back to the grid and take it, and you have a battery bank. Everything that you use from those solar panels has to come through the battery bank. And so the battery bank goes up and down, and if you're using the old lead acid batteries, those last about 10 years and they're shot. Now you've got to pay $10,000 or $12,000 and redo the battery bank, if you can get them. But now we have new lithium-ion batteries available. And there's a special type of lithium-ion battery that it doesn't lose its charge. It can take up to 10,000 cycles. You try to do that with a lead acid battery. Can't do it. 10,000 cycles to full discharge. Not just 30% like in lead acid batteries, and then you have to recharge it. You get to go down to 0 and back up 10,000 times with lithium iron phosphate batteries. But that's not all. In Germany, they've developed inverters that take your power from the solar panels, invert it to go into your house, and then you only take from the grid when you need it, when the solar panels aren't using it. Now, you see, that's much better than taking it all and putting it into the battery and then buying it back at a higher price from the grid, or taking it from the battery and using up the power and having to replace the batteries. Why not use the power from solar through the inverter into the house itself and only take from the other two as needed, including from a generator if the batteries are down, etc. Well, that's what's out there coming on the market. And so we talk about that and what those sources are. There's a huge appendix in the Secure Home. And the same appendix is in the new 5th edition of the High Security Shelter book. Now, the Secure Home does talk about how to do a high security shelter from scratch, new construction, pouring and forming concrete, etc. The generator, the filters, all of the, how to not pay $10,000 for a Swiss air filter. There's all kinds of alternatives we talk about. But most people can't use or won't use new construction because it either requires an addition to the house, an addition to the garage, or an addition that you put a basement under it, and it's more costly. Most people need this book, which is how to do a high security shelter in an existing basement. It's cheap to do it that way. You use concrete block, you reinforce it, you put a steel decking, which is readily available at concrete places, over the top, and you pour a little slurry of concrete with reinforcement, stack it with block on top, and you're done. So for less than probably $3,000 in materials, if you do it yourself, you can have a full fallout shelter. And we recommend, we have plans in this book, full architectural plans on how to do concealment. Because it doesn't do any good to have a safe room if when they come knocking at your door, the government or otherwise, or people looking for food, that they can come in or break into your safe room. You want to be able to conceal it. So we talk about how to do those types of things. I also think, and I've said this before at this Highland group, I think we will be the Jews of World War III. The people that believe in conspiracy will be targeted by the government for camps, for re-education, or for extinction, because you're not supporting the war. You blame us for what's happening. And so I think you're going to have to hide people someday. All the more reason to have secure facilities, that you have concealed entrance, like the hiding place Corrie ten Boom wrote about, or like Anne Frank. You don't just develop those in the heat of battle. You've got to have that in advance. So understanding concealment, and think of it too, how to avoid a mob of people coming down your street. You're going to get out your gun and start shooting people who are just hungry? I don't think so. But if you can get out of the way, leave the door open so they don't break anything, leave a few things to take, but get out of the way so they can't find you, they can't harm you, and these shelters are also fireproof. You know, the house burns down around you, you're going to survive. I mean, that's the better part of wisdom and judgment. So when I come to these speeches at Highland, I have these on a very steep discount. So this is normally $45 and $25, but these are about a third, at least a third off. So I recommend, if you can, pick these up. And everyone should have this little booklet, 10 Packs for Survival. It's a list of 10 storage lists, from weapons to food to water to storage and where to get things. Interesting little booklet. So this is my part in trying to help other people prepare. I try to practice what I preach. I have a shelter system, and I'm building another one, and growing gardens, and we're saving seeds, and we're doing solar, and we have generators, and we're storing fuel, and we do all the things that we try to teach you people to do. So I'm not a hypocrite. And I do this because I really believe it's going to happen someday. So I appreciate your time. I'm going to open up this for questions now, for anyone who would like to ask me some questions. Antifa. Well, anti-fascist, or Antifa, they are, of course, tomorrow claiming that they're going to create hell around the United States. And some rumors say that they're even going to create an off-the-grid or a grid-down situation. Remember, by the way, that the situation where the government is going to do a test of the grid-down situation is only a communications, alternate communications thing. They're not going to pull the grid down to test that. They're testing coordination with ham radio operators and other things. And that's something you all ought to be interested in too. When the grid does go down, you're going to need alternate communications. So everyone, ham radios now are cheap. It's easy to get the license, so I recommend everybody do that. But I don't know if Antifa is really going to pull off. I think some of the rumors are hype. I think there's going to be some demonstrations. And of course, Antifa, anti-fascists, are really communist, a lot of them, at their core. Who are the ultimate fascists. They're calling us fascists, just like they say that Hitler was on the right, but Hitler was on the left, of course. They don't want to own him, and so they put him on the right. But Antifa is a threat, to be sure, because they got big money, George Soros and other people behind them. They're going to cause a great deal of social unrest. They're going to try to make the country unlivable from Donald Trump's standpoint. But I don't think that Antifa is really going to do as much as they're claiming tomorrow. And we're going to see what happens. I have another question about what about Bitcoin? Stay away from Bitcoin and any other cryptocurrency. They're all fiat currency. They're worth nothing. They're total speculation. Yeah, I know people are making money just like they thought they were going to make money on the Iraqi dinar. I hope you didn't get trapped into that. But don't try to make money through outright speculation. This stuff will collapse someday. I guarantee it. Okay, question, Corey.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you, Joel, for your courage and your honesty. Really appreciate your voice out there. And everyone, please pray for our president, that he will have the courage and fortitude and some insight to see what's going on, at least slow things down a bit to give us more time to repent, purify ourselves, and prepare. Positive good news, if any of you haven't seen Ben Shapiro, he's a great outspoken Orthodox Jew, 34 years old, Harvard grad. He goes to college campuses and really straightens out the snowflakes, and you will love hearing him speak. They protest him like crazy, and then he really debates them. Great stuff. He doesn't understand conspiracy. He's pro-war. He's always 100% Israel, and so he doesn't get that, but everything else he's really good. That was my 15 seconds. My two questions are touch on what you talked about. One, there's a trend that I see, maybe even Latter-day Conservative before long. So if you go to ldsconservative.com, the website, you might see what's no longer on YouTube. Can you talk about that move there? They're just out and out censoring. And then also the press, in the attack in New York, they wouldn't even say an Islamist attack, a terrorist attack. They didn't say that he said Allah Akbar. They said he said some religious thing that people say at weddings. And the press is just so helping and covering for that. It's just really amazing. They're really coming out of the woodwork now in their true colors. So those two things, the YouTube censorship and the journalism. Thank you.
Thank you, Corey. The YouTube censorship is really a real thing in Facebook as well. Alex Jones has had all of his commercials cut off from all his YouTubes. They get millions of visitors. He gets nothing from them now because Google is refusing to run any ads on any of his websites. So it's really hurting them. And others have been censored. My stuff is still out there for some reason. I guess I'm not big enough, to censor yet. But this is very worrisome. I think the answer to that has to be starting competitive YouTube type channels where people can upload. It's one thing, I have my own website, other people have their own website, but you need a central thing that everything goes to, and it's not that hard to, it takes some money to get the servers, but then as you grow with that, you can increase that. But I think there needs to be an alternative to YouTube as that answer. And of course about the media, showing their outright prejudice. As I've said before in my speech, we have not seen this so blatantly done as we have this time, and it should convince most of you that there really is secret combinations and they have power. That doesn't mean that every reporter knows about it, but it means that every one of those does know that I cannot touch conspiracy, because they won't, even on Fox News. They will never touch conspiracy. The only one I can tolerate watching on Fox News is Tucker Carlson. To me, he reads sincere. At least he knows he can't speak about conspiracy, but at least he goes after people and will not tuck under. Sir.
Yeah, first of all, I want to personally thank Tom Butler for 15 years of making personal sacrifices to put these meetings on. I just want to thank you for that. And Joel, the question for you is, in the event of a war between the United States and Russia and China, can the United States win? And if you can please elaborate on that.
Yeah, that's a good question. How do they win if you absorb a nuclear first strike and destroy most of the U.S. military? Well, the advantage to the globalists, they come out of their bunkers and say, The West is now defenseless. We all depend on the U.S. military. So what do? They posed that same question, and they have a solution. It's the Hegelian dialectic: create a crisis, provide the solution that you wouldn't otherwise accept. And what's that solution? A global military organization. In other words, the UN is useless. We can't have the UN. It's going to be another League of Democracies, probably what it's going to be. And what's happening right now, and this has got to do with the betrayal of the Brexit. You know, the voters voted for the Brexit, and it was a surprise, just like the Trump thing on that. But it's being outright betrayed. You hear about all of these negotiations going on in the EU and how everything is in turmoil, and they're making it. But behind the scene is one thing that's going extremely smoothly, and I covered this in this week's World Affairs Brief, is that all of the heads of state of Britain and the EU are getting together in Germany and Poland, and they're talking about a unified military in all of Europe. Now, these people are all part of NATO, but they're getting ready to disband and break away from NATO and have their own EU army, and Britain is right in the middle of it. And here's what they said in secret, basically, was we could never do this without Brexit, because Brexit gives us the cover. They think we're out here negotiating to get rid of the EU, when in fact we're using the secret negotiations as a cover to integrate into a reformed EU. Yeah, we aren't part of it, but we're a member of the unified EU Bank, the EU Treasury, and the EU Coordinated Defense Council. And that's what's happening right now in Europe. I believe that this new EU army is going to be the core of the global military that will survive the war. And the U.S. will be out of it in terms of we won't be running things. We'll be beholden now to the... I know Americans aren't used to that. But believe me, if we absorb a nuclear first strike and our military gone, the U.S. has no cachet in the world anymore. And there's a lot of countries that like to put the U.S. under their thumb. I think, though, that there'll be pockets of liberty, even though this global government will come to pass, and you'll see it in your lifetimes. There'll be pockets of liberty as good people are driven out of the cities, as I said, you know, that no longer keeping there if things are in turmoil and unrest. They'll come back to the rural hinterland. I think we'll have new majorities that we don't have presently because of all the mainstreamers here. But we'll have new majorities of conservatives and be able to resist the New World Order in pockets of liberty.
So, Joel, one thing I don't understand about the Las Vegas shooting is, assuming that the Paddock shooting was to stir up anti-gun hysteria, I understand the need for the multiple shooters, but what was the purpose of these other shootings at the casinos, given that they just had to be hushed up if they served no purpose in the media? Was it the same perpetrators that perpetrated those shootings?
Well, because of the fact that the government is covering up and set up Paddock and is controlling the narrative, just like 9/11, it has to be the government, it has to be a government black operation of some sort. I don't have the answer to that. I have been asking myself, Andrew and I have been talking about this on the way, why have all these other things if you're just going to cover them up? Why shoot up the Tropicana and kill all those people? The story was really interesting. These guys fled from the venue, and people said, go to the Tropicana. And they got to the Tropicana, and people were saying, go into the casino. And they said, I don't want to go into a room. I don't want to be, you know, they were nervous. And they said there was this big burly guy, looked like an Israeli, who had a big suitcase, a metal, looked like a gun suitcase. And he had an earpiece on, and he was trying to get him into the casino. He said, wait a minute, who are you? Who do you work for? And he wouldn't tell him. What have you got in the suitcase, they were saying. They challenged him. And he said, you know, I don't work for the casinos. He admitted that, but he was trying to get them in. And all of a sudden, while they were arguing, he was about ready to open and show them what he had in the case, and then gunfire went off in the casino. And as they fled, he ran into the casino. Now, what ordinary person would run into the casino? And this guy was some kind of special op out there overseeing this. Why? And then cover it up? I don't know. Unless they had intended to allow it all, and what Las Vegas itself said, we're covering this up because people are not coming to Las Vegas if they know this. That's the only thing that I can, but I don't have a good answer for that. It doesn't make sense to me.
Right.
But I know this, it was a massive operation, and there was a lot of different shooters
A
there.
lot of those casinos were robbed.
Oh, were they?
Yeah, I heard Nice was in one and it was robbed. The
So what she's saying is these casinos were robbed during this shootout too. They took advantage of it and took the chips that were on the table after everybody got on the floor. That's very interesting. I had not heard that before. Yes, sir.
Hi, Joel.
Yes.
This is might be off topic, but I think it's just as serious as anything we've discussed tonight. It has to do with those multiple California fires, which, by all accounts, is not a natural occurrence. There's been evidence of directed energy weapons, otherwise known as DEW, that have been used. If so, what was the point and who directed it? Is this part of Agenda 21?
My answer to this, and I've studied this, is that this is false conspiracy about directed energy weapons firing these houses. One of the main reasons that that was said is that there were lots of trees in these subdivisions that, by the way, these fires did not start accidentally. There were no lightning storms. I think these were arson set. But I don't believe in the director. There is, you know, I'm deep into military technology and stuff, and what they're claiming, you would see these kinds of beams that would illuminate or ignite houses or obliterate houses and leave trees. In fact, the high winds show, and I've come from a state, Oregon, where you have a lot of, and when you have a high wind forest fire out of grasses, you can go under the trees and spare the trees and even torch houses if they're at least 30 or 40 feet away, and that's where those trees are standing. The proof of that is there are a lot of trees that are burned, that were closer to houses. So it is not true that all the trees were left standing and that only houses. So we have to be careful of those types of theories. There's just no reason to use directed, I mean, there aren't such a thing right now. And if you had seen them, you would have seen these huge laser beams. That's the only kind of directed that we know of that exists on these things. There's lots of ideas about Tesla ways, but they don't ignite fires. Laser beams do, and you can see those. So I don't believe the directed energy things, and I know that's a major conspiracy about the fires, but I think they were arson set, high wind speeds, and that facilitated the arson, and then they blew under the trees rather than ignite them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, over the last 6 months or so, I've been doing a lot of viewing of the different conservative YouTube videos and such, pretty much on a daily basis and such. And so, involving Dave Hodges and Common Sense Show, I'm not challenging you. I believe a lot of his stuff is it's plausible, yet also sketchy in some things. Can you just do a brief list of what types of things he's talking about that he's really wrong on?
I can't, I mean, every day I get sent, and they're all wrong. I mean, in terms of hyped up. I don't have anything off the top of my list, but you could, if you have anything, if anybody's got a computer, and just give me some Dave Hodges topics, I can tell you what. I mean, literally, I've never seen anyone who's wrong every time he writes, even though some of his things have about 80% truth. He's talking about something, but he always hypes the. I'm not sure Hodges isn't an agent provocateur, frankly. Because anybody who's really sincere is going to say, I'm sorry, I was wrong about it. He has never apologized. Have you ever heard an apology in his?
No.
No.
Okay.
I mean, I've made errors too, and I apologize in my World Affairs brief. I want to make sure I remain credible, but he never apologized.
Okay, very quick second question. In the past, you've talked about the coming Russia, China nuke attack, an EMP, and that you've stated that their intent is not to totally destroy the United States, but to keep the spoils, the tech economy and such as spoils, and that would be the globalists' hope also, more to govern.
Right.
Since Satan is behind most of these, either direct inspiration, like in front, or just whispering there, wouldn't it serve the dark purposes more just to wipe out as much of the population as possible in their sins?
Well, certainly depopulation is going to happen in this war to a large extent, and that does serve some of Satan's purposes. But you've got to remember that God is ultimately in charge, and he isn't going to allow everything to be wiped out. So Satan, you see, has to do within what he's allowed to do. And he's given a tremendous amount of leeway now. For example, there's so many people led astray by the dreams and vision movement because they go back to ancient scripture saying, young men shall dream dreams, and therefore all dreams must be of God, and that's just not true. You see, God sometimes allows in the last days Satan to have much more revelatory power than he has before. And it's a test of your spirituality to see if you can perceive that something grandiose and thing may not be true. I mean, Satan can imitate visions and glories and other types of things, and he is actually running all three predator centers. He's running the Anglo-American globalists, he's running the Russians, he's running the Chinese, and he ran Hitler. Hitler was deep into the occult, okay? But what did he do? He sacrificed Hitler to be able to boost Russia. And I think Russia's going down in the Third World War to boost China, and it's going to be China in the ultimate thing versus the Anglo-American globalist. I think that in order to win this war, as part of one of the previous questions, I think the globalists will cut a deal with China and say, all right, you help us defeat Russia, who started out with this war, because Russia's the easiest to defeat. They can't win if China's at their rear and the West is coming eastward. I think he'll pull that same thing that he did during World War II. And so ultimately, I think that Satan is after, the globalists are his prime fair hair boys. And I can't see far enough about what will happen to the Chinese. I can't see them going away. But, and I can't see how Israel finally gets, decimated in the Battle of Armageddon. But I can see the thing that concerns us immediately is that America is never going to have its liberty restored. It's a downhill run, and you've got to prepare for that. What I'm just saying is, stop living in hope that someone's going to save us, and that the elders of Israel are going to rise up and save the Constitution. They're asleep, except for you. And if you doubt my word, just tell some of these things in a sacrament meeting or to your fellow and see what the response is.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.
Hey, Joel. All right, is it working? No?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Oh, this one? This one? Oh, this one's the one that works. Okay. All right, so it's all this talk and information is wonderful, but we need a plan of action. And I'm always frustrated when I hear a wonderful speech and then I don't hear, I challenge you to do this, all right, let's do this, plan of action. So the question is, in the state of Utah, and I'm from Utah County, so let's focus on Utah County, do we have groups gathered together, focused on certain things, so that we can, a plan of action is what I'm saying. What, do we have any plans? I know that a few years ago, there was a lot of groups out there, and I know you were part of it, and there was a lot more seemed to be going on. There doesn't seem to be so much now. And I just come back about in the last 8 months, so I haven't really seen what's going on. Do we know of any groups that are working together and doing something?
I have a lot of experience in that area, having been called upon to consult with dozens of groups over the year, both in terms of theory and practice and preparation. Here's my fear and my experience. When people get together in preparedness or to commiserate about the state of the world, you end up talking and talking and talking. Just look at the Avow group, and they're all well-meaning good people. They spend hours a day discussing and arguing the things, and that's time, I believe, to be better spent preparing. What I've told you in terms of action, I have not tried to give you hope that it's going to be saved and you're not going to have to prepare. I'm saying prepare for the takedown. Prepare for war. It's coming someday. And now is the time to prepare for it. And I believe in preparing individually. If you get in a group, you will spend more time relying on people who are more prepared. And they'll spend more time trying to explain everything that nobody will be doing. And that's what I found happen, is that prepper groups get together and talk, and very few people get anything done. And so what I'm saying is the emphasis has to be individually. You have to get your own inspiration about what you need to do within your own financial capabilities to do. And there are certain things, we have a priority list that we work through about what you do if you've got limited finances. And a lot of it depends on what's coming up. A shelter isn't the first priority if the war's 10 10 years away. And I'm still saying I don't think Russia and China will be ready till the next decade, but that's coming up pretty close. But you see, Trump could change that. And China, if they decide to go to war with the U.S. over North Korea, suddenly that scenario can go up sooner. And so you see a shelter becomes a higher priority because you don't want to be sick. A lot of people say, well, I'm not going to have a shelter, I'll die. I'll just rather die. Well, the trouble is you don't die. You just get sick. You wish you were dead, but you don't die. Remember, 50% of Hiroshima survived without shelters, but they all got sick, really sick, okay? So I'm just saying, I don't have a plan of action that doesn't require preparation because I think we're headed for a takedown. And I think those that prepare are going to be in a position to help and to survive and to reconstruct the society and to preserve liberty and to fight the war later. But if you only fight now politically and don't prepare, you'll lose both politically and you'll lose your life. But if you prepare, and you can still fight and vote for the proper people, it won't do much good because we don't have real good conservative, constitutional conservative candidates. But you'll be at least be in a position to be a great leader to say, I told you so, and this is the way we need to do it, when we get another opportunity on the other side of this conflict, which does bring a lot of people back to join with us.
This city of Orem has a great political candidate, Hans Anderson.
He does.
He's awesome.
He is awesome, and his wife is awesome. I'm a friend of his father, H. Berlin Anderson, and I can tell you, but you notice this is one of the examples. He's been losing more and more because the pro-development people just get the heartstrings of the worldly people in Orem and say, yeah, we want those malls, and we want utopia, and we want all that junk, and
right.
He's fighting against that, and I've said it on K-Talk, and I'll say it here, Hans Anderson is the person we need to endorse, and his wife, and there's one other candidate, is it Harkness? I believe, Annette Harkness, that's a good one too. But watch this election, because you see, I fear we're a diminishing minority, and it's very difficult to fight against the mainstream in an all is well in Zion feeling, about, hey, we want jobs and we want growth. Well, growth has a real penalty.
I just want to say one more thing. I think that what Abraham is doing here, Abraham Lincoln, and I and some few others were trying to, stand together to take back our cities, like the city of Orem, because Orem is the second largest city in the entire state, from what I was told. And if we can win in this city, Orem, then we can start to affect all the cities all around us. And I think he has some things to say.
Okay. I don't want to discourage you from that. I'm just saying, while you fight, prepare, because
yes,
you got to prepare for the takedown while you're fighting for liberty.
But if they're taking all of our money because of their corrupt things they're doing, then we have no money to prepare.
Yeah, and then how do you stop that?
It's kind of a catch-22.
We are literally powerless to stop the diminution of our money through inflation. I mean...
No, I'm talking taxation, like the 300+ million that Orem stole from the people.
Yes, right.
That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about...
But that's a pittance. That's a pittance compared to the money that you lose every year in inflation. That's a pittance. Okay, yeah.
So, Brother Skousen, Alex Jones thinks we can defeat the globalists through information. Can it be done?
He doesn't really believe that. He's told me that personally. But he has to try, and he is trying.
I want to thank you for all you've done, for showing up today. And just wanted to ask a quick question. You mentioned that the deep state is a serious problem and almost undefeatable. I guess Alex Jones would agree with that. It would appear, and my question to you is, since it appears that the deep state is everywhere, mightn't it appear that utopia is the answer, is the face of the deep state as it appears in the local cities?
You're talking about fiber optic internet?
Actually, let me narrow that or broaden that to Agenda 21.
Well, Agenda 21 is part of the deep state, and it's part of the control agenda, control of private property, to make sure that people are not free to maneuver, to live in rural settings. You know, they want to urbanize everybody. In Agenda 21, they want to deal with population control, and of course now with climate change, which is the other false fake news that is driving, incessantly driving us towards this carbon pollution. I hope nobody buys into that. It's just a complete fraud. But it's huge. Remember, that isn't going anywhere right now, by the way. All that stuff is right now on hold while Trump is in office. So he has accomplished what we hoped cautiously, that at least would hold back their agenda. That's why I don't think, frankly, that he'll last the full 4 terms. I think they're aiming for impeachment. They're aiming for an Article 23 of the Constitution of he's crazy or he's not in capacity. They'll try to pull something, if not outright assassination. But
so last of all, then, as there are those who are tying all this development, these mega cities that are being created in Orem in particular. They're planning thousands of new apartments, and they're going to take a strip called the State Street Corridor, Orem State Street Corridor. They're going to close hundreds of businesses down. They're going to take another strip over on 800 West. They're going to turn that little 2-lane highway into a 5-lane highway, tear out all those homes. They're going to take out a whole bunch of homes on 1200 West, 3 different trailer parks. All those families will be displaced. This looks like the most impressive battle of the Agenda 21 that maybe is going on in the state right now. Hans Anderson was told specifically that by one of the guys in the city that the vote by mail was a specific guarantee that he would not be reelected. Now, he and his wife are the only ones that are fighting against the Agenda 21ers right now, and it appears that if there was anybody in Orem that would like to engage in this, there's a handful of us that have a plan of attack that could be used, and we believe that anyone in Orem who votes for just Hans and his wife Melody would give us the best possible chance of winning in Orem. Now there's 10, Orem has the contractual obligation to sue 10 other cities if they try and pull out of these Agenda 21 contracts. So there are those who believe that the Orem race has an argument to be the most important race on the Wasatch Front, maybe the most important race in Utah for city council. Tom Butler knows about these city council races. We believe that race, the Orem race, may be the most important race in the state. What do you think of that?
I concur. Hans Anderson is a real litmus test for us, and it'll see whether or not there's enough conservative votes in Orem left, and it'll be a real test. And
so we would invite anybody who would like to help with that battle. That is a battle that could be fought right here, right now. We have 4 days, I guess, until Tuesday. And when we have a plan with that, I'll have to talk to anybody who wants to help afterwards. Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Skousen. There's something that I've never heard anybody discuss, and hopefully you might have. This may be something that will come back to bite us. I believe it was during Obama's first campaign in 2008. He said, "I'm going to build the largest private military, on the planet." And I couldn't even believe he was saying it. And then all of a sudden, the Department of Homeland Security started buying up 2 billion rounds of hollow point ammunition. And I've never heard anybody discuss where did all that go? How's it supposed to be used? Is it going to come back on us?
They never did buy the 2 billion rounds of ammunition. They did that to scare the conservatives into throwing out an email trail that the NSA could trace to see who was concerned about it. It was a trap. So be careful about these hyper type things, because they never did buy the bullets. That was just a requisition.
Okay, well, as that was supposedly happening, which is this the first I've heard that it didn't, all the ammunition dried up.
Yeah, but that was for other reasons unrelated to that, yeah. But they never did buy the 2 billion bullets. I mean, that was just ludicrous. That was a setup so the NSA could track who was the anti-gun or pro-gun people.
Two quick questions. Number one, what is your opinion of some of the prophecies of Julie Rowe?
I am very suspicious. Let me just, visions of glory, let me discuss that first. I think it was not of the Lord. And the reason I say that is it was too much revelation. Even the prophets of God don't hardly get any open revelation anymore, let alone monthly, weekly, day after day. It's too much revelation. It breaks the pattern. I think, it's typically of Satan giving a person what they want, mostly true information, and then some curveballs. There's some real curveballs in there that are wrong, okay? Same with Julie Rowe. Even near-death experiences can be falsified by Satan. So just because someone has a near-death experience and it sounds so true, remember, there's a telltale satanic trap in every one of those near-death experiences. What is it? It's the unconditional love of the Savior. No matter what they were on earth, it's this all-loving, all-accepting embrace. That's a doctrine of Satan, not of the Lord. The Lord's love is very conditional, based upon righteousness. He is not unconditionally loving and making everything go away. But that's something that virtually I have seen in every single near-death experience, and I don't think it's true. So I'm very suspicious of it. Personally, my feeling is that the Lord is cutting off the open revelatory type of things in the last days, because we've had so much, and we've had so much scripture over the years, that it's time for the Lord to test what your ability to perceive by listening to conscience, by listening to the Spirit, and discerning for yourself. And that's why it's so damaging to become dependent on who's having the latest dream or vision. You see, when you become dependent on that, you're not thinking for yourself. And believe me, they're contradictory, especially as to timing of when it's going to happen. Dozens of these things were supposed to happen, 3 weeks after President Monson became president and other things, and they didn't happen. These are signs that there are curveballs of these, there are falsehoods being thrown, that you're being given a scenario that is attractive because it's about last days and hard times, which you know are coming. But you've got to watch for the falsehoods that are involved. I throw them all, I don't listen to any of them. I've had my own personal manifestations and I've never written about them, I never intend to, because I don't know if they're true until they come true. And that's the way you should keep silent, you should not be sharing these things.
Question number 2. You said you're not excited about Bitcoin. Why?
Because it's fiat. It's actually without any value whatsoever. And believe me, if you try to do a monetary based upon gold and silver, the government will shut you down. They're not trying to shut down Bitcoin. Or there's, a dozen other imitations of it now, all competing for a piece of the speculative pie. But it's pure speculation. I don't believe that the Lord blesses people who try to get wealthy by speculation. I believe the Lord tries to inspire people through hard work, through diligence, but not through speculation. You don't get blessed. And because people get wealthy and they think, I'm being blessed. No, they're not. That's a test. And people, I believe, will lose everything someday in these Bitcoin-type cryptocurrencies.
Yeah, a follow-up question, if I might.
Yeah.
So you don't believe that the blockchain is capable of limiting the numbers of Bitcoin?
It doesn't matter. It's still fiat. Even if you limit it, it's still no value. There's no value. It's a mythical creation. There is no value there except perceived. And I'm saying that has to collapse someday.
A couple of questions for you. A few months ago, they were talking about, the rumor was that President Trump was slurring his words, and the possibility that he was either some form of dementia or possibly drugged, some things like that. And so I'm curious because I'd like to know what your opinion is with John Kelly and the cabinet and the possibility of in Article 25, I think it is.
Article 23.
And then I think recently Jeb Bush had been quoted as saying that President Trump would be out in the next couple of months.
Well, there's a lot of predictions here and there. Look, Trump isn't showing any signs of slurring speech in public. He's very, so I doubt that that's true. But they're looking for any mental instability they can use in Article 23. They're desperate to remove it. And they could be putting some things in his food as well. You know, that's what they did with Richard Nixon. Henry Kissinger had Richard Nixon, was in one of the biographies, had him on antidepressants to keep him subdued so that Henry Kissinger could basically run the presidency over Henry. So I wouldn't put it past them to put something in his food could cause mental problems.
Yeah, may or may not be true. I just think the story is interesting. But really, how would you judge the loyalty of the cabinet?
Oh, they're not loyal at all to it.
Not over.
They're globalists. Yeah, and yeah, they're. I mean, I believe that Rex Tillerson actually did call the president a moron, and sometimes I think he's a moron too. I mean, even though I like him, I think he has some good instincts. He's dumber than a bat sometimes.
Okay, so how about Vice President Pence? Is he loyal or?
I think Vice President Pence is loyal to the president. I think he is a compromising Christian. He will give in under pressure. I think he's a legitimate Christian. He wanted to do what was right in terms of the anti-discrimination law in Nebraska, and then as soon as the national press came down on him, he backed out faster than a rabbit could run. In other words, he doesn't have any staying power. But I still think he's sincere as a Christian, just a soft, weak Christian.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, Brother Skousen, I agree that Kim Jong-un is an evil that would be better off not in this world. However, I'm concerned about the moral high ground of attacking without a provocation.
Okay, the provocation is that he's directly threatened the United States with missiles. He's threatened to destroy the United States. You don't need any more provocation to actually get a declaration of war, which I think Trump should do before he attacks. I think there is sufficient provocation. You have the means being developed and you have the verbal threats. I mean, what else do you do and say, we're going to destroy you? I take you at your word. Declaration of war and you're out of here.
Hey, Brother Skousen. So a lot of the political stuff I hear from you, I agree with almost everything you say. And I think a lot of our political stuff comes from the war in heaven. I think it's a direct model of what we saw in the war in heaven. We see every political campaign follows Satan's campaign, in my opinion. With that said, and with everything you're saying tonight, with what's going to happen in our world, how is the second coming, in your opinion, going to play into this? What are we to expect?
Well, that's a real tough question to get into religious subjects here. I do agree with your statement that this is a reflection of the war in heaven, which was essentially, Satan was playing upon the fact that most of the people in the pre-existence knew they would have a tough time making it, okay? Believe me, we weren't all sitting around at the feet of the Savior raising our hand to the atonement. Everything that you see on earth was playing out in the pre-existence. Liberals, conservatives, anti-war, gays, business, worldly people, you know, spirits can see what's going on in the earth, and they're getting enticed by the, ooh, I want to do that when I get, ooh, I want to do that. And that's why people come here predisposed. It's called an innate spirit that's already hardened. And that's why your spirit and what you are as a person is so difficult to change, because it was rock formed. I mean, forget about gifting. Mozart was creating music in the pre-existence. There are spiritual pianos. Bach and he were collaborating. And that's why they created what they did when they're here. But that's why we have such hardened opinions here, why it's very difficult to change people, because of this innateness. And so Satan plays upon that. Why do you think he got a third of the people not to even come? It's because, hey, we're convinced we're not going to make it through this thing without going through the chains of hell. So we're not going. It was a very real decision. It wasn't just because we're all evil, you know, it's because we've messed up so much here, we're not going to make it. But you remember, even Cain came down here. So forget about everybody raising their hand to the atonement. Cain was master mayhem. He was perdition before the world. And that means that evil was allowed to come here as long as they're willing to take the consequences of coming to the earth. You didn't have to agree to the atonement to come here. Anyone could come. And Cain proves that. Hitler was no saint in the pre-existence. Neither was Mussolini. Neither was Stalin and Mao. So they came down here and fulfilled their roles on behalf of Satan. And there's a lot of people you see that have worldly weaknesses. And that's why I'm so concerned about the youth in the public education system. It's the greatest contamination we've got in the world besides the mainstream media, is to send your children, and that's why we're a losing minority, because you parents send your children to government schools and they get indoctrinated. And when they, even if you undo the political indoctrination, they're getting immersed in bad social attitudes, haughtiness, you know, quipping one with another, light-mindedness and goading and sexual connotations and everything. And you don't think that affects them? You bet it affects them, no matter what you do in family home evening. You know, if you really want to save the nation, you got to stop sending your children to public schools. And that's where Satan's agenda, but you see, he's out for comfort. And why does Satan have so much power? Because it appeals to people's softness. I provide guaranteed safety, not based upon worth. Everybody gets the same reward because you're all children of God, so you all get the same reward. You see, that's an easy thing. It's really attractive. And exactly what he's saying here, that's playing out today. Socialism is that same attraction. Everybody gets the same wage. None of these wealthy, no poverty, everybody gets the same wage, and you buy it because you think, gee, isn't that nice, a utopian world. But you're exactly right. It's playing out just like it did before, because we were in the process, just like we are now, 1,000 different personalities and different levels of intelligence and political affiliation, and it's playing out right here. That's my opinion anyway. Now, as to the second coming, I disagree with my uncle's conclusion, who felt that before the second coming that both North and South America were going to be a great Zion society. I believe that the world will be totally in the control of Satan before the second coming, except for the New Jerusalem. The only place upon the face of the earth, according to the 45th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, where people will not be at war one with another. That doesn't sound to me like the church is never going to have to flee again, as someone recently said. It doesn't mean just because there's a temple that there will be safety. Only in the New Jerusalem will be not war with one another. And that means, because of his divine protection, that I think the entire world is under the control of Satan. And the second coming comes because it's the only way to finally put an end to Satan's control, is for the Savior to come and say, enough. The test is over. You have failed, except for the true sheep, who have already gathered in. And the whole purpose of the 144,000 miraculously coming to the New Jews is to go out into the world and gather those that are crying day and night for deliverance. So forget about, if you are faithful, you shall not fear. That means fear for your salvation. Doesn't mean you will not fear when war and persecution and torture comes. You see what I mean? The 144,000 go out to save those who are crying day and night for deliverance. That doesn't sound to me like they're not in any fear, but they don't fear for their salvation because they're doing what's right. That's my feeling anyway.
Thank you. Can I follow up with a question?
Yes.
You touched on homeschooling, which I thought was interesting because we homeschool. And I'm constantly, me and my wife were constantly battled with, my mom's a school teacher, my aunt worked in the district, a lot of our family does not understand why would we homeschool. And they always say, aren't you afraid your kids aren't going to learn enough in math, or they're going to be behind in English? Yes, we have those concerns, but what worries me more is the stuff that you were talking about of what they will learn in school that I don't want them to learn. How do we have this discussion? How do we help people understand that my kids are safer even if they don't get the best out of the math or the English? I can find tutors for that. But
you know,
how do we have that conversation?
I don't try to convince people who cannot see what's obvious around them. You see, anybody who's in the public schools who likes it cannot obviously see the contamination of social attitudes that are going on, or they tolerate it. There's certain people that tolerate lack of discipline, and there are other people that don't. I'm one of those that don't tolerate lack of discipline. My children sensed that, and so they became very disciplined. We homeschooled all of them, and we ran into the same thing. But I don't try to convert public school teachers. If they're in the public schools and they don't see what's going on, I mean, at least you owe them the argument, these are not our schools. Don't ever let anyone tell you these are our schools. They're not our schools. They're government schools. And just because they say a committee of you, it's the committee that rules. And that's not me. And I've tried to serve on a school board, and I know that you get nowhere, because even if you convince the board, the lawyer sits there and says, you can't do that because the law says you cannot do this and this and this. And everybody nods their heads and goes away. And so I said, forget this. I'm only helping maintain a corrupt institution if I help improve the public schools. So I do not believe in improving public schools. That only keeps people in them longer. Remember, it's the social contamination. You can make up for everything else, but you cannot undo the social contamination that they get. Now, my children were all homeschooled. None of them are deficient in math. Most of them are engineers or other things, and they went to college at 14. So you can do with homeschooling much more than what you do, because they don't waste any time. We're the slowest common denominator. You take them as fast as you want. Now, it takes sacrifice, especially by the wife, who has to take most of the load in homeschooling. But I can tell you that the greatest thing that we benefit was not just the education, but was the fact that our kids grew up without the social contamination. They matured in terms of sexual things later than most, because they weren't hyped up all the time with this boy, girl, who's dating who and who's sleeping with whom. Their minds weren't controlled with that. So by the time they did date, they were already mature, and they were used to talking adults. And so, see, they were much more able to choose and not be caught up in the fads of the day in selecting a mate. So all of them had married well and done well, and didn't date till much later in life, because they were doing productive things. And we didn't let our homeschool children play with other kids. They come to the door, they say, can you play? And our children were trying to say, what do you have in mind? Oh, I don't really just want to play. No, we don't do that, but we are building some projects in the garage. If you want to come help us build, you see, you can do that. But we never let our kids just go play. You've got to have a purpose in doing things, and that's the way real life is.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So over the last several years, we've seen a really big push by the globalists, coordinated with the media, to make Islam very popular, bring in the refugees, bring in people that are known to have extreme ideologies. And so I'm wondering how you think that Islam and the role of Islam fits into kind of the bigger conspiracy with the globalists, with Russia and China.
Well, that's a big question. I think Islam is being used, frankly. The Muslims are the cannon fodder ever since World War I, when they carved up these states like Iraq and Iran. And Iraq was a disaster. It should have been 3 separate countries instead of one. They created that because it would create conflict, and eventually would allow them to be used as cannon fodder in war, in conflict. And I think now they're being used. They're also being used to destroy Western culture in Europe. I think they created the wars not only for globalist purposes, but to drive out refugees and bring them into Europe, so as to destroy, as the illegal immigrants in America, destroying the conservative majority, and we're not the majority anymore. So that's happening in Europe, and so there's a cultural element of destruction of Western culture, and I think there's a lot of good people. My Uncle Cleon used to go to Israel and the Arab countries and had wonderful relationships with both of them when you meet good people in either one of them. And so good Muslims who don't attribute to that are really good people. And, but still, even though they're good people, there are certain cultures that are not compatible with the West in terms of the way they treat females, and some of their other types of habits, just not compatible with Western culture. And so I do believe that the original or immigration law that we had, which gave preference to the Western culture in terms of immigration, was the correct policy. That was changed in 1976, I believe, to destroy that quota system and allow the others. And now it's like reverse discrimination. We bring in refugees and into our society, and they never do integrate. They become part of the ghettos. And so I think it's part of a multicultural agenda of destruction of Western culture.
Thank you.
How are you, Graciela?
Fine. Thank you, Joel. It's wonderful to see you continue your work. My question may not interest the majority of the people here, but it probably interests you. As you know, I come from Argentina, and you have connections with South America. I would like to know what's going on there, since I've been absent for 47 years, and what's going on in Peru, Argentina, Uruguay, and in particular, what is the story with Catalonia?
Well, the big story in Catalonia is the antithesis or the antipathy that the establishment has for independence movements. Do you realize there's no constitution in the world that allows for independence, for secession? Not even the U.S. Constitution allows for secession. And that was cemented after the Civil War, of course, in the Pledge of Allegiance. One nation under God, indivisible. And when I say the pledge, I never say indivisible. Because if it's indivisible, if you cannot lead, no matter how tyrannical it becomes, you're no better than the Soviet Union, right? And that's the denigration of the Declaration of Independence. There should always be, the trouble is, once you start secession movements, there's no stopping it. And this is why I don't think the Lord backed up the Civil War. I think that's why he did not. Because had the Civil War split, the Civil War, the southern states would have split into 3 within about 10 years, and the northern states would have been into 2 and 3, and we'd probably have, and then you'd be attacked and you'd never survive. So I think for pragmatic reasons, the Lord realizes that people tend, like in entropy in physics, you know, to get further apart. When you have disagreements, with liberals, it only takes one thing to get them together. With conservatives, it only takes one thing to break them apart, right? And so that's what happens. I think the problem with secession is not that ideologically it is due. Ideologically, we should all have the right to band together and separate ourselves and form our own government situations. But as a practical matter, you're going to get preyed upon because there is a Satan in the world. There's systematic evil, and they will capture and attack any smaller unit that they can. And I think for pragmatic reasons, the Lord sacrificed some liberty in order to keep this country as a big enough one for other purposes that he has. So the Lord's somewhat pragmatic in terms of this test, but in the ultimate universe, he's totally idealistic, and you know, you will get the perfect amount of liberty that you have. The countries of, I don't have time to go through all of the countries, but I will say that, you know, there are several of these countries that are now that are fully in the hands of, well, were in the hands of Marxists. Brazil, for example, had 2 presidents who were Marxists, masquerading as, in other words, you see what's happened in Venezuela. Bolivia has a Marxist. Peru has a Marxist as a president. Chile has a Marxist, former communist woman president. But they're playing it pretty safe now because of the commerce, at least, you know, that's what drives. These people will go under very, very rapidly if they stop cutting off, if they cut off trade with the West. So they're playing the Red China role. And Red China's having much more influence now in Latin America than Russia used to have. They're taking over Russia's role, and they're taking the same mantra of playing the capitalist role all the way preparing someday for a Marxist revolution. But fortunately, in Argentina, you know, you got rid of Cristina and the other Marxists, and you have more your globalist mainstreamers in there. And so I think they're relatively stable for now, although Uruguay is still under the hand of the coalition of Marxists in the Frente Amplia. But generally speaking, I think Latin America isn't going to go downward. They're afraid to do what Venezuela's doing, and rightfully so, which is going to really collapse now that their bond market has collapsed. So I think it's fairly stable right now.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Well, thank you very much for being here. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and I hope I've been able to answer some of your concerns and give you a bigger picture of the world. Thank you.